The UK is increasingly suffering from the impacts of climate change. Like many parts of the world, each year extreme events become more common and more extreme. Now, engineered approaches to these challenges can only go so far, and in many cases are too expensive or simply can't keep up with the pace of change. And so it is clear that we urgently need to turn to nature for help. According to a growing body of evidence from science and from practice, if we restore and protect the natural world, it will in turn shield us from the impacts of climate change as well as slowing warming. In this film, we will discover how people across the UK are working with nature to build resilience and protect biodiversity across our coastlands and inland waterways and across our working lands.
If we wanted to make money out of it, then the best thing would be is to get a bottle of glyphosate and kill everything on the meadow and then reseed it with ryegrass. But the feature of these meadows is their huge biodiversity, and that came about because they are highly stressed. There are meadows which one year may flood, next year may be experiencing drought, and as a result of that, they are probably one of the most biodiverse patches of UK land that you can find.
I've only recently been introduced to floodplain meadows, and when I first saw it, I just couldn't believe what a floodplain meadow would look like. And having seen it now after a winter flood, I'm even more amazed at the diversity of flowering plants and the diversity of insects that are associated with it. It was the sort of gold standard of what we would look at in other meadows.
Well, for my group, looking at the flies, the biodiversity was significantly higher in the Longmead meadow samples.
They're reacting to the diversity of plants. My group of leafhoppers and planthoppers are primarily or all plant feeding, and so they will respond to a diversity of plants that they like. For pollinators, of course, they want a diversity of flowers or flowering plants. Birds will be happier in such a habitat, but other insects and other invertebrates as well. I mean, more spiders, which probably means more birds. It just means a healthier environment in that region. And if you've got a healthy meadow, they can then colonise other meadows nearby.
You've got to put in place some kind of management structure that's going to allow that. And you've also got to find the landowners that are prepared to do that and persuade them either through their own philanthropy, but much better if you dangle a carrot of it's going to earn you so much money and we're going to help you earn that money, then the chances are they will take it and start to do that. To do that, we take the seed in the form of green hay from our meadow, prepare other riverside fields, they might even be arable fields, and then we spread the green hay on that and it reseeds. And so the idea is really to take this kind of project into the landscape scale. And so the worst thing you could ever do to one of these floodplain meadows is plough it up for arable crop, because you will lose 1,000 years of carbon storage. The plant that you're looking at behind me is probably 100 or 200 years old. So by natural selection, you've got plants here which can survive this amazing stress that they have to tolerate year in, year out, and for thousands of years now. And so if you're looking for something that is going to help you with climate change and keep going through this climate change, then I'm sitting in it. Amazing thing about these meadows is they've been delivering ecosystem services, which we now value as this thing called natural capital. And they've been doing it quietly on their own, without shouting, without a PR department, for over 1,000 years. They just get on and they do it. So one of the projects that we've got in terms of studying all of this ecosystem is looking at water quality. And so we have dip wells. And what we see is that the phosphates and the nitrates are massively high. And why this is because, of course, farmers put phosphate and nitrate on their arable fields to make their crops grow. When that water comes onto this land, the plants trap nitrogen, they trap the phosphate, and they will keep it here. And so when the flood subsides, instead of going into the river, those pollutants stay here and actually are used by the plants for growth, or trapped in the soil as compounds of phosphate. All these plants have different root depths and so on, and that has given a structure to the soil which makes it highly absorbent. And so when you flood it, it's like a sponge. It just soaks up the water. And of course, it creates a buffer also. So they are providing this ecosystem service of flood management. They provide, of course, a crop. And what's interesting about that is the crop arrives without any fertilizer and without any pesticides. And it arrives consistently year after year.
Last winter this meadow was under water for 3 months, and all around Oxford the agricultural land was flooded. And so the arable land, the crops were completely ruined. My meadow, as you can see now, is absolutely thriving. So the crop never fails. You've always got a crop. And so that's why actually historically They were the most valuable land in the country. We understand its value in food production, 21st century food production, but it's been lost from our culture. They used to call them the hospital meadows. So if you had a sick cow or a sick sheep, you brought them down to these old meadows and you didn't need to get the vet. And the farmers around here who have them still say that the nutrients are very valuable.
A couple of miles along the river in Oxford, there is one such farmer that understands the great value of floodplain meadows as part of sustainable farming.
For the whole time that I've been farming, it's always been focused on a conventional model, I guess you could say. Classically, the more input you put in, the more output you get out. So we'd be thinking about it from that point of view. And then it was last spring when we were lambing in April, and it had been the wettest winter on record. Every winter now it's the wettest winter on record. But the wettest winter on record, and in April I was standing in a lambing field and there were cracks in the ground, and I just stood there and thought, where has all the water gone? I just don't understand. And that again helped with me redefining productivity. It was like, well, if I could hold on to more of that water that was here in the winter into our soils, we'd be growing grass all the way through the summer, and that's going to give us the biggest productivity boost that we would ever get. For the last 2 years, I've kind of been through a huge transition, and we now use regenerative agriculture in order to manage the farm. We still farm the same things, but the change in the way we approach our farming is totally different. Now we put ecosystem processes, so photosynthesis, water cycles, mineral cycles, at the kind of heart of the decisions we make when we do things on the farm. So we use adaptive multi-paddock grazing, also known as holistic planned grazing. And effectively that is a large number of animals in a small area for a short period of time. But when I say small area, you can see the cows behind us. It's not like really tiny, but it just concentrates them. And that kind of influences their grazing action slightly, in that they tend to try different things. Plants that were maybe undesirable in the past, like docks, suddenly become desirable because they've got deep roots, they go down and they access a mineral layer that maybe the more common grasses can't. And then that fundamental thing is followed by a long rest period. In the main, we would be aiming for between a 60 and 180 day rest. And that is creating all of this mess and long tall grass that you see behind us. But that's exactly what we want, because that's what brings the biodiversity. But we've taken that hay from our floodplain species-rich meadows, and we roll it out every day for the cows in the winter. So it's just like getting kind of a fresh bite of summer every day throughout the winter. I actually used to kind of dismiss our floodplain meadows as stemmy old stuff that didn't have much energy and nutritional value that we needed in order to get our animals to grow quickly. And over the last few years, I've had a complete mind unpicking about that, and now I kind of understand their real value. With species diversity, the more species you get, the more that's unlocked in the soil, the different root depths feed down to different mineral layers, and generally it's kind of the same thing for humans. It forms part of a varied diet. And we see that reflected in the way that the animals perform. So our animals are kind of happy, healthy, they're really content at grass on this hay. And we really believe it's because of the diversity within the hay that we're getting from the floodplain meadows that is enabling them not only to just maintain, but to gain condition. And also, really interestingly, eating less. So really interesting for me, because it kind of throws the whole sustainable intensification on its head. It's kind of widely accepted that when you transition from conventional to organic farming, that you accept a lower productivity. But what I found really exciting about regenerative agriculture and taking that approach is that our productivity is increasing. We're now finishing cattle, starting to finish cattle in 16 months with very little input and certainly no feed or fertiliser. In the old days for us, even when we were using grain as part of our finishing ration, we would not start finishing until about 20 months. And at the same time, we're also growing a lot more grass. We're able to leave a lot behind as well, which helps with the regenerating of the soil, leaves solar panels of leaves behind to create more grass, and keeps the soil covered at all times, which means we don't get evaporation, we're not losing water, our soil temperature is staying stable, so cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter, which again adds to our productivity. So you might look at this field and think, oh, we could have got another 2 days grazing out of this cell here. But actually what we're doing is protecting our soil first, because ultimately that will lead us to be more productive in the long run. So we've kind of got these benefits coming all round. Our outwintering costs are significantly reduced. Our medicine use is significantly less because the worm burden on our sheep in particular has dropped dramatically. The labour time in what we're doing, we now have a redundant topper and nobody spends any time topping. There's all these kind of little bits that all build up to make the picture more economically viable because it's less inputs. Our aim now is how do we get all of our animals outwintered, and then we can use our sheds for something else, maybe caravans, as that makes more money than farming. You might want to cut that a bit.
Unfortunately, farmers like Claire are, like floodplain meadows, too few and far between. Most still apply lots of chemicals on their lands, which, as well as harming biodiversity locally, flow into our rivers and eventually to the sea. This situation is particularly severe in the south of England, along the Solent coast.
Which one is this? It's this Audi, which just makes this fantastic sheet. So it is definitely overgrown, and you can see the blackness. And you can see it's just extraordinary. See that hopefully gets over. Yeah, look, there's a couple just sitting on the surface.
So we went to the Isle of Wight to find out how this process being led by the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust works in practice.
In 2018 there was something that's called the Dutch nitrates case, and that was a ruling by the European Court to say that Natura 2000 sites could no longer be continued to be polluted. And that led Natural England here in Britain to use the same approach. So they basically said no more development until there's mitigation. So the way it works is that any development now, before it's allowed to go ahead with planning, they've got to demonstrate that they have some mitigation in place to mitigate for the additional pollution that they will add through building houses. And this is about adding wastewater to the wastewater treatment works. So this is around, additional toilets essentially in every house. So the development has to then basically buy a certain amount of nitrate mitigation credits in order to allow planning permission to be given. And what they've done is they've looked at ways in which nitrates can be taken out of the river system. So really it's about targeting intensive farmland, that farmland that is the most polluting and adding the most pollution to the system, and looking at converting that land use to something more natural. So the two things came together, habitat change to take nitrates out of the system, and the opportunity to create more nature reserves and more wild spaces and more rewilding opportunities. Now, because we're the Wildlife Trust, we actually want to deliver more than just, a kind of straight offset. We want to deliver reduction of pollution. So the scheme that we've set up here is we will sell a certain number of nitrate credits, but we also want to do some additional land habitat creation, and we won't sell all of those credits, so that we're basically creating an overall reduction in pollution rather than just offsetting, because offsetting isn't enough. We've got to actually make the situation better and not just keep it the same. So that's really important to us as a Wildlife Trust. We do have an ethical eligibility process. So we ask developers to fill in an application form. We then screen those to make sure that those are developments that are acceptable from a sort of biodiversity and ecological point of view. And we refuse to sell to developers who are promoting a development that we would object to. We're also working with local planning authorities to really promote the idea of more sustainable building practice, things like biodiversity net gain, making sure that the developers are doing the best they can. If we are going to have houses, let's do it in the best way possible, and let's work together to remove this pollution and reduce the impact of that development, and start to really kind of change that discussion.
So when we took on this site, and a lot of it was just bare ground with maize stalks on it. So that first year saw a sort of a blossoming, if you like, of arable flora. So lots of really nice arable weeds, what we term arable weeds, but arable flora. So some quite nice, rare, unique plants, and just the whole field systems were just covered in wonderful flora. So consequently, huge draw for insects. And then obviously you kick in that sort of bio chain and the birds come in, and then it's been really, really exciting to see. So, and this year, we've moved over to a sort of that classic successional process. So a lot more weeds, or what we perceive as weeds, or what can be perceived as weeds, have come in. But thistles, docks, bit of ragwort. But these are still fantastic plants for wildlife. Those seeds produced by those thistles and docks are great for overwintering birds. Those critically, threatened arable birds, those bird numbers that have crashed over the last 40, 50 years, so it's important that these food stocks are available for them to feed on. So it's been a real exciting journey. We've started to see reptiles on the site again. So in the last week we've seen an adder and a grass snake. We've had the white-tailed eagles visiting and roosting in the local woodlands, bat species. So we're gathering all this data. It's really exciting. I got really excited the other day when I saw a hare lopping around in one of the fields. It's fantastic. So stuff is returning, and it's looking really positive for this site.
Ron Holland, a farmer on the Isle of Wight, used to own the land that is now being restored by the Wildlife Trust.
I just find those thistles rather offensive, I must admit. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've been criticised for reducing, the amount of food that we're growing in the UK, and at a time when that's more important than ever. Particularly from the farming community, they see this as land being taken away from food production, land no longer having that agricultural supporting function, and they see that as a detrimental thing rather than a positive thing in trying to restore the balance through the loss of biodiversity that, agriculture's played a massively significant part in. On the Isle of Wight, 20% of the available arable is growing crops for anaerobic digestion, so-called green energy. So that argument is completely, it just doesn't exist. And as a whole rewilding movement across the UK, we're talking very, very small percentage of the landscape being dedicated to rewilding for the environment. Most of it is still intensively farmed, so that just doesn't stack up. So we're all critically aware that soil structure is being severely damaged by agricultural practice. Runoff, pesticides, nutrients, they're all being stripped from our soils. Much of the land we're looking to rewild isn't productive land. It needs a lot of inputs, so that's a lot of energy, a lot of fertilisers, lots of pesticides to grow a crop that we are then going to consume. It seems ridiculous. There's been lots of cited papers saying there's only 100 harvests left because the soils are being so irreparably damaged, and we can't continue to do that. Otherwise we'll end up with just dust bowls, and it'll be just carnage, it'll be horrendous. And rewilding offers that great opportunity to restore those soils by, allowing nature to, and all of its wonderful creatures, the mycorrhizal interactions, the activities of worms, all of these things can redress that balance, get nutrients back into the soils, capture carbon. There's loads of positives from rewilding. And there's future options. Perhaps some of this suboptimal land in future could be rotated and turned into productive arable lands, once the soils have recovered and are much better, which we know will happen if given time to do that. So, these sites could move back into agriculture in a big rotational system. So we're not, advising that the whole of the UK become a rewilded landscape. This is much more about, just trying to restore suitable habitats and trying to win back the environmental gains. So, favour those prime soils for those agricultural production, and this sort of suboptimal habitat can be rewilded. And I think this offers options for farming as well as it does for the conservation sector as well. So farming relies on good soils. If you can reduce the inputs going in because your soils are much healthier, then it's a win-win situation.
Nowhere in the world produces more than areas of the Amazon that are untouched. More biomass is produced there than any human intervened farming system. So we kind of got to look at what nature can do, because actually nature-based farming can often be thought of, like I say, lower productivity, but actually nature is very abundant if we let it, and that's what we're seeing reflected in our farming system.
So we have seen that there is a way of bringing nature and farming together. But what about development? Can we continue to develop, to build houses, whilst also restoring nature? Back on the mainland, Fishlake Meadows might hold the answer. While most nature-based solutions involve restoring whole ecological communities, sometimes one species can play a particularly important role. Now, the beaver is a charismatic example that has been in the limelight recently for its role in reducing inland flooding. Much less well known but equally important is the humble oyster. To find out more, we headed to Newcastle.
So over the last probably 150 years, oysters have declined globally by about 85% and 95% in Europe. So they're actually quite rare now, especially here in northeast England. We don't have any wild stocks of oysters left at all. And they've declined from a number of different stressors. And even though a lot of these stressors have decreased in recent years, the oysters just aren't able to recover on their own, which is why we need to help them recover and restore those reef systems. Our marine ecosystem is full of pollutants and excess nutrients, and it can be a real problem, and oysters can really help us with this. Each oyster can filter 200 litres of water a day, and this can include excess nutrients and contaminants. So they can help us to clear our water of those toxins, but also to make the water clearer, and that clarity can really help a lot of other species such as seagrass, which needs light to photosynthesize, so they can have that knock-on effect in a wider sense as well. Also, they attract biodiversity, so oysters actually form oyster reefs, which are, I guess, a bit similar to coral reefs in the way that they form this 3D structure on the seabed, and it creates habitat for lots of different species to live in and call their home. So it can attract commercial fish species. Lots of different animals come to these oyster reefs and have protection from predation and things like that. So they boost biodiversity, they clean our waters, they provide fisheries, lots of different ecosystem services to us as humans. So we're taking a two-phased approach in our oyster restoration here in the Wild Oysters project, and the first stage is the oyster nurseries. So we have sites across the UK, 6 different sites in Scotland, England and Wales, where we have oyster nurseries which are essentially maternity wards for oysters. So we have adult oysters kept in the marine environment and they reproduce in those cages, and that's the main primary point of those oyster nurseries, is to release the oyster larvae, the baby oysters, into the North Sea here and to start repopulating wild populations. And we monitor these nurseries. We bring volunteers down here and do some citizen science to collect data on what's happening at these nurseries. So we look for the oyster health, but we also try to establish what biodiversity these sort of artificial reefs are attracting to the area. So we do net surveys for mobile species and photograph the sessile species that are living on the shells of the oysters, and we record that data to go into a national database for all our sites around the UK. Our next phase of delivery is actually to restore the seabed to make it as good as possible for those larvae to survive. So we have done some spatial models to predict where the larvae will reach, and then we'll be adding culch to the seabed, which is a mixture of shells and gravel, and that'll be added onto the seabed to create a habitat that the oysters like. They like that calcium carbonate source and they like the texture, and we don't have a lot of that left naturally anymore in our ecosystems, so we're going to add that habitat back in, and the oyster larvae will hopefully reach that location and settle to the seabed and grow into adults and form these really diverse 3D reefs that we're looking for.
While oysters are helping to protect biodiversity and reduce climate impacts on the north coast, in other parts of the UK, salt marshes are playing this role. Indeed, when it comes to building defences against climate change, it is becoming clear that we really need nature's help.
For the coastal realignment here, the past solution was to reinforce a beach to make sure that it never breached and that it never flooded the farmland behind it. Every single winter, big chunks of it would get battering from southwesterlies, was being replaced every single year by the Environment Agency. Massive amounts of money. The pressures on the system were clear and growing year by year. It was only a matter of time before there was a catastrophic breach and either properties or the vast area of sort of farmland behind it was in real trouble from saltwater flooding or a catastrophic event. In fact, one particular event breached the caravan park, flooded out,
and that just wiped out many of the caravans, the biggest caravan site, independent one in Europe, and it was really scary. And as the lowest house down, the lowest lying house, I was extremely concerned. Crikey, we can't even sell our houses here. We're absolutely stuffed. You've got your mortgage, blah, blah, blah. What are we going to do?
The option that we took was to involve nature in part of the solution. On a basic level, that meant building a new embankment 7 kilometres long, set back from the beach, and then allowing the sea to break through and flood around about sort of 200 hectares of land.
And to their credit, their idea looked quite interesting, which was rather than just take on all the energy of the waves, set it back and let the wave energy dissipate by rolling slightly up the hill, eventually to meet the new wall that's set further back. And in most cases, the sea doesn't at present even come to the wall. It's going to last a lot longer, and it's going to take your 1 in 1 chance of losing your house, that's once a year flooding, to 1 in 1,000. Whoa, that's pretty good. Okay, that's a no-brainer. So it's more chance of wildlife growing and expanding, etc. And gives us protection for our houses so we could then sell them. So that worked out perfectly.
This used to be fields, but now it's gradually becoming intertidal mud, salt marsh, saline-induced lagoons. It's a stunning landscape which is quite different from anything that was there before. Birds are starting to make use of it. Every year you can go back and you can see little changes that are happening. Unlike large parts of the Solent, Medbury so far isn't seeing the big impacts from nitrates and nutrient pollution that we see elsewhere. There are no vast sheets of green algae on Medbury at present. What we are seeing is that gradually, as the ex-arable land returns and becomes intertidal, mudflats, we're seeing the starts of seagrass, we're seeing the starts of oysters colonising the site. It's good habitat, it's becoming better. Elsewhere in the Solent, we need to concentrate on removing the impacts that have already occurred, and then the long fight to get it back to what it needs to be and what it should be. What Medbury has shown us is that the options for the future are clear. When we step back, when we allow nature to look after us, to show what it can do, it will deliver what we need it to do. At Medbury, we step back, we allow nature to take its course within a broad parameter, and it's given us so much.
In this film, we have seen how we can harness the power of nature to help us adapt to the impacts of climate change. And we've also seen how these nature-based solutions can go hand in hand with both farming and development. So we really need to ensure that these projects and others like them are financially supported and scientifically studied to ensure that they can be taken to scale in a way that benefits climate, people and biodiversity for the long term.